bronze from the silver. Oh yeah, that don't make no sense. On paper, it all adds up, the math works, but somehow the trench comes here and wait a minute, we're 6 feet off. How did that
It's funny how they do the tunnel and stuff. They come in on one side of the river and another, and these are the tunnels right. That right there is pretty amazing. I've worked for directional drilling crews. We've done the same thing. Like we shift channel and stuff like that. Started on one side, another crew started on the other side, and we'll come in. But this is just pretty close. He'll back out and does it.
Now, you work for yourself or you work for a contractor?
For the contract.
Yeah,
I work for myself.
Yeah. You gotta buy the equipment,
Yeah, you're not working for yourself. You're still working for somebody else. It does not matter.
You never knew. Even when you're working for yourself, you're working for a customer. Exactly.
Good morning, everybody. It is great to be with you all this morning. Leave it up to the song leader to remind you that you're wearing the wrong shirt and tie. I have that verse on a shirt or on a tie I should have worn this morning. It is great to be with you all this morning. Glad that you're all here. Want to welcome those who are joining us online, and we're glad that we have that technology that allows us to be together. Do we have any Lord of the Rings fans in the house? Any fellow Lord of the Rings fans? Okay, I got some like-minded spirits. I like the Lord of the Rings. It's a good book series. I know it by the movies because I'm not much of a reader. Not J.K. Rowling's or not R.R. Tolkien level reader. Definitely not that. But anyway, it's a great book because it has great quotes within it. Lots of lessons to be learned. For instance, as Bilbo Baggins is having his 111th birthday, he says, "I don't know half of you half as well as I should like, and I like less than half of you half than well than as you deserve." That is a quote that has puzzled me for many years. But as I stand before you this morning, I kind of relate to it. I know half of you about half as well as I would like, and I like half of you half as well as you deserve, right? I'd like to know more of you, right? I'd like to, and those of you who I know, I'd like to know better and spend more time with. That's at least that's the way I'm interpreting it. Maybe it was an insult. I don't know. There's lots of debates online. Here's another great quote from The Lord of the Rings. Frodo tells Gandalf he's late, and he responds, "A wizard is never late, nor is he early. He arrives precisely when he means to." As a preacher who's often late, I like to change this up a little bit. A preacher never arrives early, nor is he late. He arrives precisely when he means to. Of course, that's false because, I'm just tardy and irresponsible, and it's something I need to work on. But you know what is true? That God is never late, nor is he early. He arrives precisely when he means to. I'm sure you've had one of those situations where you have been in prayer, where you have been seeking God's favor, or you've been seeking God's help in some area, and you're asking God to show up, and it seems like he's late. And when he finally shows up, you're like, "God, you're late." And God very kindly looks down at us and says, "Child, I'm never late, nor am I early. I arrive precisely when I mean to." When we come to this area of our lives, I think it's important that we remember our role and God's role, right? God knows what he's doing. God's in control. He knows when he needs to show up and when he needs to wait. Our job is to scatter the seed. God's job is to give the increase. God's job is to be the one who shows himself strong. We're simply called to be faithful. Said another way, sometimes we're called to wait. Sometimes we're called to wait. Waiting is never fun. It is not easy. It is not enjoyable. Ask any small child who is waiting on Christmas or a holiday or a birthday or something that they are looking forward to, but waiting is never easy. We are often saying, go, right? Let's go, God. Let's go do things. It's time. And often God is saying, wait. Wait. And this should not surprise us because it is throughout the pages of Scripture that we have examples of the people of God saying, let's go, and God saying, wait. We have to go no further than Abraham and Sarah. Now, to their credit, they waited for 15 years. But at some point, as they were saying, let's go, Sarah said, I'm the problem. Go without me. Take Hagar. Have a son with him, or with her. And they did. Ended up causing all sorts of problems in the Middle East that we continue to deal with because of the family dynamics that took place from that interaction because they were impatient. Family continues with the same mindset. Rebekah and Jacob undermining Isaac and Esau as they seek to steal the blessing because they could not wait upon God to be the one to give the blessing. They had to intervene. They had to be the ones who injected themselves into the situation. We continue down the family tree a little bit more, and we find Moses at the age of 40 going when God said, wait, killing an Egyptian, ending up on the run for 40 years, finding himself a shepherd before a burning bush, saying, yeah, but is it really time? I'm really not the one who's called to do this. This struggle that we have between God saying wait and then when God says go, us going. Hannah in distress for years over the fact that she is not having the child that she so desperately longs for, finding herself in a long tradition of barren women who are praying to God, please give me my child. And eventually God in His right timing says, here's Samuel. And Samuel brings us to another interesting story. As Saul, failing to wait upon Samuel to come and offer the sacrifice, finds himself doing the final sin that will remove the kingdom from him because he couldn't wait upon Saul's timing, or upon Samuel's timing to come and offer that sacrifice. He had to do it then. And as a result, the kingdom would be taken from him. The Scriptures are filled with examples of godly people who were wrestling with wanting to go, wanting to do, wanting to move things forward, and God saying, not yet. Wait. Wait. I think one of the best examples, maybe even one of the most complex examples of this would be David. David was anointed king, but he had to wait upon the Lord's timing. Let's pick up our reading here. 1 Samuel chapter 16, starting in verse 1. The Lord said to Samuel, how long will you grieve over Saul, since I have rejected him from being king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and go. I will send you to Jesse, to the Bethlehemite, for I have provided for myself a king among his sons. We jump then to verses 12 and 13. And he sent and brought him in. Now he was ruddy and had beautiful eyes, and he was handsome. And the Lord said, arise and anoint him, for it is he. Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brothers. And the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon David. From that day forward, Samuel arose and went to Ramah. We jump all the way to verse 22. Saul sent to Jesse, saying, let David remain in my service, for he has found favor in my sight. Now, obviously, there's a lot of text in between there, but we have the story told for us, highlighted, of David becoming king, or being anointed king. A young man out tending the sheep, the youngest of his brothers. God sends and anoints him as the next king of Israel, because Saul had messed up, because Saul had gotten prideful. Eventually, David found himself, very soon after this, in the service of Saul. He started out as a giant slayer, then as a musician. He became then a soldier, and finally a leader of men. David succeeded in everything that God gave him to do. David found himself successful time and time and time again. And Saul began to realize that God was no longer with him, that God had no longer put a blessing upon him and his work as king. And he began to notice that this young man in his service did have God's blessing, that everything that David did prospered. And Saul put two and two together and figured out that David was a threat. First, it was jealousy, and eventually it became violence. But David was quick. He was able to dodge the spears that were thrown at him, but eventually he had to flee. He had to go on the run. He was in the desert from place to place, fleeing from Saul, from hiding place to hiding place. Slowly he gathered himself around him several hundred men who would fight with him and protect him and believed in him. We jump all the way to 1 Samuel chapter 24, starting in verses 2 through 7. Saul took 3,000 choice men out of all of Israel, and he went to seek David and his men in front of the wild goats' rocks. He came to the sheepfold by the he came to the sheepfolds by the way, where there was a cave, and Saul went in to relieve himself. Now David and his men were sitting in the innermost part of the cave, and the men of David said to him, "Here is the day which the Lord has said to you, Behold, I will give your enemies into your hand, and you shall do to him as it seems good to you." Then David arose stealthily, and he cut off the corner of Saul's robe. Afterwards David's heart sunk within him, because he had cut off the corner of Saul's robe. He said to his men, "Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my Lord, the Lord's anointed, and put out my hand against him, seeing that he is the Lord's anointed." So David persuaded his men with these words, and did not permit them to attack Saul. Saul arose up, and he left the cave, and he went on his way. Saul rises up with 3,000 choice men with a singular purpose: find David and kill him. He got himself a posse, and they went out. Now David and his men were on the run, and they were very good at what they were doing. So good, in fact, that as they hid in the innermost part of this cave, Saul and his men didn't even realize that a group of several hundred men had run into these caves. They'd covered their tracks so well that Saul needed a bathroom break and goes into the cave unaccompanied, completely unaware that there is a complete conversation going on feet, yards away from him. The men respond to David, "Here's the day. Your enemy has walked in before you. The Lord has given him into your hands. Arise and take your vengeance." David very stealthily begins to walk towards Saul, succeeds in getting so close to him that he's able to reach down and cut off the corner of his robe, and he sneaks back. Now, if I was one of David's men, and David sneaks back and he finds his hiding place again, I'd be like, "What are you doing? You had him. Take one good strike at him and he's gone. Like victory is ours. What are you doing?" And David proceeds to have a crisis of conscience. How can I lift my hand against the Lord's anointed? I shouldn't have even cut off the corner of his robe. And he holds back his men, and what a conversation and a situation that must have been, and an echoey cave as they were whispering back and forth, trying to hold his men back. Don't you dare go after him. What was David thinking? What was David thinking when he was calling his men to hold their hand? Was this not the Lord's divine appointment? But see, David says that it's not time. See, I'm going to wait on the Lord's timing. I'm going to wait on the Lord's timing. It's not the right time. Now, how's that the case? I think this is one of the reasons we wrestle with this so much. Right? We tell the story often. Right? A flood waters are coming, and The police car rolls up and says, there's an evacuation order, there's a flood coming, get in, I'll get you to safety. And the guy says, no, I'm waiting on God's time, God will protect me. Right? Pretty soon the floodwaters are getting high enough and a boat comes trolling by. It's going to get worse, buddy, get in. No, I'm waiting on God's timing. Eventually you're on top of your house and here comes a helicopter. Grab a hold. Get in. I'll save you. No, go on. God will protect me. Saul walks into the cave, completely unaware. David literally catches him with his pants down. And David says, no, it's not time. We go, what? What do you mean it's not time? How much clearer can God make it? God gave him into your hands. And yet for some reason, David looks at the situation and says, it's not the time yet. It's not time yet. Now, the reason behind David's thinking seems to center around his respect for authority. David does not believe it is his place to take the kingdom by force. That God in His wisdom, in His own time, will remove Saul, and that when that day comes, David will then be anointed as king, proper, fully. That he will then be king over Israel. He knows that that is his destiny. But he is unwilling at this point to fight for it, because he believes that he should not raise his hand against the Lord's anointed, even though the Lord's anointed is attacking him. Now, there might be some wisdom in what David is doing here. If David rises up and strikes down Saul, and Saul's head goes rolling out of the cave down to his men, I don't think the 3,000 men sitting outside the cave are going to look down and go, well, I guess we've been relieved of our duty, and then leave. More than likely, David and his men would be stuck in a cave doing the whole 3,000 Spartans, right? I mean, it would be a challenging battle going forth. So there might be some wisdom in what David's doing, understanding that if he attacked now, he would be hard-pressed to get out of the situation. And even if he was, it would be hard for him as the assassin of the king to then rule as the king following. So there might be some wisdom in what David is doing, but that's not the logic necessarily that David then lays out for his men. What David says is, I should not raise my hand against the Lord's anointed. David is conscience-stricken by the fact that he cut off the corner of Saul's robe, that he has disrespected the king in this way. David wants to respect the authority that God has established in Israel. Saul leaves the cave. David then follows him out. They then have a conversation. The Lord gave you into my hands. I was able to cut off the corner of your robe. You were completely unaware. You were dead to rights. I mean you no harm. Saul acknowledges that God had given him into his hands. He acknowledges the good standing of Saul. Saul goes on his way. David goes in peace. All that ends well is well, right? I mean, that seems to be the case. Until time passes on and Saul once again says, I need to take care of David. We jump all the way to chapter 26, starting in verse 7. David and Abijah went to the army by night, and there lay Saul, sleeping with an encampment, with his spear stuck in the ground next to his head, and Abner, the army laid around him. Then Abijah said to David, God has given your enemy into your hand this day. Now please let me pin him to the earth with one stroke of the spear. I will not strike him twice. But David said to Abijah, do not destroy him, for who can put out his hand against the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? And David said, as the Lord lives, the Lord will strike him. On his day he will come to die, or he will go down into battle, and he will perish. The Lord forbid that I should put my hand out against the Lord's anointed. But take now the spear that is at his head, and the jar of water, and let us go. So David took the spear and the jar of water and at Saul's head, and they went away. For no man saw it, nor knew it, nor did any of them awake. For they were all asleep, because a deep sleep from the Lord had fallen upon them. Deja vu. Very similar story. 3,000 men from Israel are hand-selected by Saul, and they go out to battle with one purpose: find David and kill him. They find themselves encamped, and David goes down as they're sleeping. Saul is caught completely defenseless once again. His chief bodyguard, sound asleep. Asleep, we are told, that is from the Lord. David could have come down with a beatbox on, or a speaker on his shoulder, right, with loud music playing, and nobody would have been the wiser. God was keeping them all asleep. They go down into the camp. They find themselves, Saul and one of David's right-hand men are like, God has given them all into your hands again. Victory is ours. Give me the chance, David. I'll strike the king where he lays. He won't feel a thing. I'll not strike him twice. Just let me at him. And once again, David says, no. No. I think the same 2 points applies here, and I think that's what we see within the text. David, once again, is waiting upon the Lord's timing. While many of us would say, how much more clear can God make it? Strike the man where he lies. David says it's not time. Ultimately, David knows that the Lord will take out Saul when he's good and ready. Whether it be a heart attack, old age, he goes down into battle, one of his lieutenants rebels against him and strikes him down. Whatever it is, David says, I will not do it, nor will I allow one of my men to do it. We will not raise our hand against the Lord's anointed. On this point, David and Paul are very much in tune. This respect for authority, this following of authority, this trusting in God. David knows that God is in control, and he is not worried about taking out Saul. Saul might be out for David, but David is not out for Saul. Now, very similar to the story before, when David and his men retreat, as morning comes, David stands on the hill and calls down to Saul, Saul, you missing anything? Your spear? Your water jug? And oh yeah, you chief protector of the king, what were you doing sleeping on the job? If I wanted you dead, you would be dead right now. I do not. Once again, Saul acknowledges that God has given him into David's hand, that David means him no harm. The army goes home. David is left in peace. It's not long after this that Saul meets his end. David, basically prophetic words come to pass. Saul and his sons are fighting against the Philistines, and the Philistines strike his sons dead. Saul is mortally wounded, even asking his bodyguard, run me through. This is not good. I will not survive this. Finish me now. And his bodyguard says, I cannot strike down the king. Saul dies. His sons are dead. David slowly becomes king as the house of Saul surrenders to that, and all of Israel is united under David. David actually was very close to being in this battle, as a side note. He had come under the protection of the Philistine king, had actually gotten in pretty close with the king. But as they were going into battle, all of the king's generals looked around and went, yeah, we don't want him in battle. David has killed many Philistines and been an enemy of ours for many years. We don't feel like it's a good idea for David to be in battle with us, and they send him away. So David came very close to being in the battle that killed Saul on the opposing side, which would have raised an interesting dilemma for us to see played out. Would David have switched sides in the middle of the battle and protected the king? Would he have stood by and let the king perish? Would he have begged for Saul's life? We don't know. That's not the way things played out. But it raises some interesting questions that almost became a thing. Instead, David was sent away. And in God's timing, Saul perished. And in the timing of God, David became king, began to rule and reign. When we look over David's life, or at least this area of David's life, we have many challenges as we wrestle through the applications of what we take upon ourselves. Anytime we look at large swaths of text like this, and we look at a story arc like this, there's challenges. And as we look at David's reasonings, and as we try to infer what that means for us, we have challenges. Why didn't David strike Saul down? Why did he not fight back? It seems very clear to me, and throughout the rest of Scripture, this idea of not rebelling, of following leadership, of waiting upon God's timing. That seems to be the themes that I walk away with from this text. And this seems to be what David also walks away from this experience with. There are several Psalms upon which we can read this concept of waiting upon the Lord. As David writes and says, come and save me from my enemies, Lord. I will wait upon your timing. Now, it's hard to know if any of these were written at this time or written with these things in mind. A few of the Psalms that you might consider reading this afternoon: Psalm 27, Psalm 40, and Psalm 62. 62 is a favorite of mine. All of these seem to have an indication of the hiding in the rock, the going to a place of refuge, God being my shield. Very similar language that we would expect in a time like this, but we don't know when these Psalms were written. Maybe they were written years later, maybe reflecting back upon this time or current crises. We don't know. But David had this concept that he held on to of waiting upon God. I think one of the struggles for us is knowing when we're in a season of waiting. Because just because something doesn't come easy doesn't mean it's not the Lord's timing. Sometimes you got to make things happen. Sometimes you got to work hard. Sometimes you got to apply yourself and you got to push through boundaries and through barriers. Sometimes you find yourself kicking against the goad. Sometimes you find yourself fighting against God. And as Gamaliel and as Jesus said to Saul, those are not good things to do. There's no point in kicking against the goad. There's no point fighting against God. So when we find ourselves in a season that says, wait, it's good for us to wait. It's important for us to wait. That's hard to do. It's a difficult thing to wait upon the Lord's timing because we want it now. We think it would work good now. We think God is more than capable of doing it now. So why don't we do it now? And yet, sometimes God says, wait. I did not prepare this lesson late enough in the week to have known what Larimer County was going to do. Quite frankly, things have gone on so long, in my opinion, that I didn't think they were ever going to do anything. That seems to be the demeanor of many in politics. So all of these things that I have said before, and as we go forward, that I will say now, was said on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday in my minds. Personally, I think we're in a pandemic. We still have a long way to go in that, whether we want to admit it or not. I think we're in a season of wait. I think we're in a season where we have to kind of take a breath. As we entered 2020, we had lots of plans. We had lots of visions. We had lots of things we wanted to do. And all of a sudden, God said, wait. Things were put on hold. It's uncomfortable. It's not where we want to be. It's frustrating. It's difficult to wait. But that seems to be where we are. But I think we should take heart, because as we look at the story of David, David was not sleeping that whole time. He was not inactive that whole time. God was working on the heart of David in the desert among his men. He was teaching David lessons during those times, and David was active. David fought against the enemies of Israel. He defeated the enemies of Israel. He protected Israel during this time as he was on the run. He was not inactive. He was not unproductive. He was doing things. And very similarly, as we look at ourselves, as we've been in a season that I would consider of waiting, we've still been doing things, have we not? For the past 20 months, we have been active. Maybe not in the ways that we wanted to be, not to the level that we wanted to be, but we have been active. We're here this morning. We're together. We're worshiping God. We're praising God. We're studying the Scriptures. Our Wednesday night classes are back. Our Bible classes are back and going. Our Coke drive never went away. We had to work hard to make sure that thing continued, and we have continued to do well in that area. The women's ministry is working on getting up and going again to full capacity. The men's breakfasts are going again. And there is a number of things that we have done over the past 20 months that were not planned, that we had not anticipated doing, but we did anyway because the opportunity presented itself. The opportunity to serve our community, to meet needs arose, and we rose to that occasion. We've been in a season of wait. But just because we've been in a season of wait does not mean in any way, shape, or form that we're not at work or that God is not using us, because it is never a waste of time to obey and wait upon God. It's never a waste to wait upon the Lord. We are simply called to be faithful. We're simply called to scatter seed as the opportunity presents itself. He gives the increase. So we do what we can when we can, as often as we can. We make good use of the time set before us, seeking the Lord's favor, seeking His wisdom whenever we can. So as we look at all this, what is our takeaway? Well, number one, I want you not to be discouraged in this season of our lives. Don't be discouraged. God is at work. God is in control. He is at work in and among us. He is working in and through us, even now. He's the one who will give the increase. We are simply called to be faithful. So what is God calling you to do in this season of life? What are the skills and the abilities that you have been given, the things that God has laid upon your heart that we can be preparing and working towards now, so that when God says go, we can go, and we can work diligently. Out here in this hallway is a bulletin board. I don't know if you've walked past it, but Connie Taft has done an amazing job on that, and I'm going to brag on her for a moment. She has all the different things that we've been doing lately, all the ways that we've been seeking to be connected and seeking to connect and serve our community. One of the circles that she put up, I love, which is, what is your ideas? What are the things that you have on your heart? What are the concepts that you have that we could add to that board? Then she says, tell somebody. Tell somebody. Talk to others. That's when ideas go from ideas to action plans. I think that's right. I think that's right. So in a season of wait, I think we need to be thinking outside the box and considering how we should serve. How do we prepare for that next season when God says go? Because He's the one in control. Here at this church, we're a family. We're a community. We help and we support each other. And as always, we want to extend to anybody, whether you be here present in person or whether you be online, that if you need anything, you need the encouragement of the church, you need the prayers of the church, you need help, we want you to let us know. And you can always do that, but especially at the end of the service. So here in a second, when Carl gets up and leads that song, if you want to come forward and let those needs be known, we want to meet those needs. But I began this sermon with quotes from The Lord of the Rings, and I want to end in the same way. Frodo laments his situation as he's on this journey. He says, "I wish the ring had never come to me. I wish none of this had happened." Gandalf responds to him, "So do all who live in such times, but that is not for them to decide. All we have now is to do what all we have to decide is what to do with the time given to us. There are other forces at work, Frodo, than the works of evil. Bilbo was meant to find the ring, in which case you also were meant to have it, and that is an encouraging thought." In very much the similar way, we don't want the difficult times that have come to us. There are other forces at work than that of evil. You have been brought to such a time. God has given this time to you. He believes you can do it. And I believe that's an encouraging thought. Let's sing.